All right, without further ado, let's welcome the Prime Minister.
Ricky, sorry, could you collect which motions the teams vetoed?
Oh, yeah, sure.
So we vetoed the last motion, which was, what was it? We vetoed each other's different motions, so we had exact opposite rankings.
Okay. We're doing the gold.
Yeah, we're doing Goldwater.
Goldwater roll, okay. All right, ready when you are.
In a debate at Sydney Mini last year, I publicly made claims about Joe Biden having a Swiss cheese brain and being demented. At the moment, that conversation that I expressed there is about the state of affairs online about Joe Biden's mental acuity. Discussion about the mental health and the mental acuity of candidates happens regardless of the Goldwater rule. The difference is that it's candidates and it's people that are not qualified to offer those opinions, but are not bound by professional restraints because they're not psychologists. It's important to understand the Goldwater rule in this debate came about in a world where media was highly centralized to particular organizations, and there weren't voices that could easily rebut those claims. That is not the world that we exist in today. It is one with a diverse amount of voices that are easily able to rebut and refute claims, but also with a psychiatry industry that has strong professional standards. Quickly, by way of model what we support, we would oppose the Goldwater rule, but importantly, we would still make it unethical to make baseless statements about the mental health or acuity of any other candidate. We'd note two further things that are important. Other psychiatrists can explain the diagnostic basis where it isn't sufficient. So if someone makes a claim and they're a psychiatrist and they go, Joe Biden blinks his eyes in a weird way, you then have other psychiatrists that debunk that and discredit that. We also broadly think that people in this world are now then able to comment. We think importantly, to the extent that you've engaged in unethical attacks, you are still exposed to psychiatric standards and the reputational costs that come with that when you engage in baseless statements. 3 points in this speech. Firstly, why the public has a genuine interest in knowing about the mental acuity of candidates. Secondly, why we would like to get accurate diagnoses. And then thirdly, the effect of these diagnoses on the discussion around the mental acuity of candidates. First, on public interest. We think that mental acuity is an operative condition in political decisions you make about whether or not you vote for a candidate, for a few reasons. The first is that you elect them for a period of time, and it's important to know whether or not they can fulfill their functions before or after you elect that candidate, because during that time, oftentimes you can't immediately remedy that situation, especially in a context like the United States where the Goldwater rule takes place, where you often have 4-year term periods. It's incredibly hard to remove that person due to high constitutional barriers. Secondly, we also think people elect people on the basis of making decisions and their capacity to make those decisions and what they do. And the fact that whether or not they don't follow through with that is a particularly important consideration. For example, we already allow people to vote on things like someone's personality, whether or not they've lied. These are all relevant factors about their capacity to follow through with their promises, and mental acuity is but another feature that is important to that is arbitrarily discriminated against at the moment. What is important to demonstrate here is that the public have a right to know, but also importantly, when candidates hide this, they are actively lying to people. It's particularly important though, because a lot of decisions these candidates make when they're president are things like control over the nuclear football and whether or not a state goes to war or not, engaging in geopolitical actions. These are things that affect millions of people's lives, and it's important that you have access to all the information possible to accurately critique them. It's your right, and it's important. Secondly, why do I think we get accurate diagnoses? Diagnoses will be within the ambit of science, or they're going to be sanctioned in this case. We don't think there's going to be room for incorrect or baseless claims, in particular because any claim that you make is likely to be incredibly vetted. Simultaneously, though, we also think there's room for professional disagreement, so you can still make a claim and it's vetted, and you would not be exposed to professional standards if it was made in good faith and based on good reasons. There are a number of reasons why these decisions will be accurate. The first is that you bear extraordinary reputational costs in your ability to practice at the point that you've made a false declaration about someone's mental acuity. If I was a psychiatrist, for example, I would be disbarred for saying Joe Biden was demented and had a Swiss cheese brain for no reason whatsoever. But if it was the case that I instead based it off the fact that from various public speeches he's engaged in a way that would indicate there's a diagnosis there, then that public discussion could happen. They'll also come under fire from just the media itself in general, and people, like particularly psychiatrists and medical professionals that aren't public figures, don't necessarily want undue public scrutiny. So there's an added burden of not speaking out unless you're absolutely certain about the diagnosis you're about to impose. Importantly, though, we think you get more information on that candidate, you can make judgments. The negative team might tell you that this is different different to a controlled environment where all of a sudden in a doctor's room or psychiatrist room, you can talk to that person. But every time you assess someone in a psychiatric manner, it's always performative. No person ever wants to be labeled as being mentally unwell, and no person ever wants to have their acuity questioned, which means in the same way where speech is a performative, you're trying to present themselves, so too are your personal interactions with psychiatrists. The very art of it is pointing out little indicators that would note that you struggle to remember certain things, and you might have early onset dementia, for example. That doesn't change in a person or interpersonal connection. Importantly, as opposed to the past where the Goldwater rule took place as opposed to today, the advent of social media and YouTube and various ways in which you can view speeches gives psychiatrists a large wealth of information under which they can base that decision. Which means that when you get things like marginal claims, those will be debated, they will be refuted, and they will be vetted. When you get clear cases, that is important and incredibly valuable information. And when you get bad faith claims from psychiatrists, they will be disbarred and their reputations will be destroyed. So this information will be accurate. That brings me nicely then onto the effect and how this changes public discourse around mental acuity. At the moment, this debate takes place in a world where there is a huge amount of fake news that is particularly targeted to candidates and particular factors about those candidates, one of those factors being mental acuity and mental health. This will be incredibly curative for 3 reasons. Firstly, it means that officials basically what is it here? Oh, it means that officials basically can't rebut at the moment, otherwise it would be speculation, right? So at the moment when someone makes a spurious claim through fake news, a psychiatrist can't get involved and they can't say that claim is false because they would then be breaching the Goldwater rule by making a comment at the moment, which means psychiatrists, the most qualified people, do not have the capacity to currently critique that process. An example here is quite good is the Clinton health fiasco during the 2016 election. Doctors were able to get in and say, we can reject this on this basis, Clinton's health appears to be fine. That is an over-exaggeration. It seems bizarre that again, in a factor where your health and your well-being might be important, where doctors can join that debate, psychiatrists cannot. We empower them to act against those voices. But secondly, importantly, it drives officials to verify independently whether or not their mental acuity is functioning. At the point this is being questioned, there's usually a pretty good basis for it as to why you might want to challenge that. Joe Biden does have very serious questions he needs to answer to the US electorate about whether or not he would be an appropriate candidate for president. At the point that psychiatrists are able to get involved in this, that means Joe Biden has to take further steps to do this, like release medical information that demonstrates he's an appropriate candidate for this position and has the mental acuity to do so. They may say this is a rights violation, but quite frankly, at the point you control nuclear weapons and millions of lives are at risk, that is a reasonable cost to bear. You consent to be a politician. Thirdly, in terms of bad actors, it's important to note that beyond fake news, the largest voices at the moment tend to be pundits, people like Tucker Carlson that make comments about people's mental health, and there's no professional voice that is able to respond to them. There are 2 kinds of responses from the public. There are people that are not particularly sophisticated and fall for the pundits at the moment. At the point there's someone that's a psychiatrist, they're marginally more likely to go, okay, that person is more likely to be trusted. But it's these people that are already skeptical of Tucker Carlson's claims already that are probably the most effective group in this debate, because they're the ones that outright deride him, and they force news organizations that comment on this to actually get independent psychiatric advice to make more credible claims. And even if in the worst case, you get the Republicans bringing on a shill psychiatric candidate, they can still be professionally sanctioned and their career can be ruined if they do not offer accurate diagnoses. The impact here is that we get conversations that need to happen around candidates, given the power they wield and the amount of control they hold over people's lives we propose.
Thank you for that speech. May I welcome the Leader of Opposition?
Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay, let's get into it. A few things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to explain why we think that these diagnoses will always be fundamentally inaccurate, and at least even if they're somewhat accurate at the level in which they're diagnosed, the way in which this information will be disseminated in the media is unlikely to be accurate. I'm then going to examine what they think the probative value of this information is, because I don't think it is actually as useful as they make out to be. And then we're going to explain a whole host of harms that arise from this behavior, ranging from to those individuals themselves, but also broader society. Because here's a snippet of what's to come. We actually don't think, in the vast majority of circumstances, mental health ought to disqualify you from jobs. The reality is a good large proportion of society suffers from mental health problems, and the majority of these people can carry out their duties just fine. And it creates a extremely harmful norm to suggest that that ought to be something that we encourage. So let's firstly look at whether these diagnoses are likely to be accurate, because we have a number of reasons as to suggest that they will not be. The first is that obviously, as someone diagnosing someone from afar, you do not have access to the majority of that person's information. You probably see them in a very small window of time. You might see Donald Trump once a week or once a day when he's making a certain press conference, but you do not have access to the wealth of information that would actually lead you to make a proper diagnosis. And that's why psychiatrists literally spend hours and hours and hours getting to know their patients, seeing what medications they react to, and those sorts of things to be able to inform and have an accurate diagnosis, right? The second reason why we think this is likely to be inaccurate, though, is because many times your perception of an individual is tainted by external factors. So, for example, our perception of Donald Trump is often, dictated by things like how, he looks in the media, or how the PR machine works, and things like that. And note, this is not just a debate about politicians. This is about all public officials, and external factors do affect the way that we see and shape them as well. Thirdly, though, we just think it is an unfortunate reality, and maybe this isn't the majority of this debate, but this is at least some of this debate, that a lot of the psychiatrists we're talking about are likely to be weaponized by political parties to make a diagnosis against another individual for political gain. And, their thing about, but you'll be punished, right? And that prevents inaccurate diagnoses, or at least diagnoses that are tainted by political means, I just do not think is one that actually applies, for the reasons that you can be protected by political influences, or the fact that mental illness is something that just does not have overwhelming consensus. And they said themselves that there'd probably be discussion about this. So, the difference obviously between someone with depression or someone with bipolar may not be readily apparent. So it's very easy to hide behind the shield of, well, that was just my opinion based on what I thought based on the evidence, right? So I just think it's unlikely that people will be punished in the way that they say. It'll be very easy to make an argument for why you thought your diagnosis was accurate, right? But even if the diagnosis itself is likely to be accurate, that's not even the most important thing. It's about how that will play out in the media sphere, and how that will be discussed within political parties and within the public arena, right? And because of things like media sound bites, because of the way that we understand and interpret mental illness at the moment, it's unlikely that that discussion is going to be accurate, right? And that has a number of implications for the way that we understand mental illness, which I'll talk about in my next point. But I think that just suggests that the probative value of this is unlikely to be particularly useful. They then make the comparative, which is to say, but the status quo that exists now is your everyday person calling Joe Biden, I don't know what the term they used, a potato brain or something like that, right? And that's, maybe that exists, and maybe that's bad, right? But just because there exists bad speculation at the moment, that is not an argument to encourage other types of bad speculation. Maybe it's not quite as bad because someone who has some education as a psychiatrist is doing it, but it's still bad for the reasons that I identified, because it's not likely to be accurate. But all you do is create a norm that says that you should be able to speculate, and you should be able to make claims about mental health, and you should be able to make what you think is an educated guess, even if you are an ordinary Joe. But if their problem is people being rampant and speculating about things that they don't know about, well, there are obviously ways that we can address that. We can serve to educate people. That's not a reason to open up the floodgates. So because of all of this, I think it's clear that the probative value of this information is very little, because if it's likely to be inaccurate in the majority of circumstances, then I don't think that actually serves to, educate voter bases about who they're electing for president. But I'd also suggest there are just a wealth of other things that we can look to as a means to disqualify someone from public office. Is that person too aggressive? Does that person have a history of decisions that would disqualify them? Like, I understand that mental illness is maybe one thing that might helpfully inform you about whether someone ought to be elected, but there are just a myriad of other things that you can also consider that could inform your voting decision. And again, if this information is on balance likely to be inaccurate, I don't think that it serves much probative value. So why is this then bad? I think it's bad for the reason of privacy. Now, obviously, these people are, in a number of cases seeking public office, and they deserve some scrutiny, but that doesn't necessarily mean they've consented to every facet of how they feel being delved into. And again, this debate is not just about politicians, it's about all public figures. They haven't necessarily consented to that. But also, this is unlikely to be, if we care about the performance of public officials, then what ought to be important to you is those people being honest about their mental health and them seeking help if they do have mental health issues. This absolutely disincentivizes these individuals from doing so, because now, if you speak up about mental health, if you're ever seen walking into a psychiatrist's office, that is like opening the floodgates for people to now speculate about your mental health condition. That absolutely disincentivizes people from getting help if they have a mental illness. And that should be the thing that Affirmative team care about if they want people to be making sound judgments in public office. But this is also super harmful for a lot of everyday individuals. And I'd suggest this is more important than can we make a slightly more accurate judgment about the person that we are electing. The first reason is because it's likely to lead to misunderstanding and stereotypes about what mental illness is. The reality is mental illness is complicated. The distinction between someone with bipolar and depression is quite a nuanced thing that's difficult to understand. And I think because this information is likely to be inaccurate, because this information is likely to be sensationalized by media, you're likely to have incorrect understandings which permeate through everyday society. But even if this information is likely to be on balance accurate in a lot of circumstances, it is still bad. One, because it creates a norm that it's okay to speculate about mental health. Even if it's okay for these public individuals because they might have consented to it, it's not okay for your everyday person who just wants to get a job and has now had their employer ask a million questions about their mental health history. It also creates a norm that mental health ought to be a disqualifier for you as a job when the majority is a huge number of people have mental illness and can do their jobs completely okay and can still be productive members of society. The mechanism is obviously pretty clear here. Media discourse and discussion filters down into everyday society. We internalize it and we act on it in turn. For all of those reasons, very, very proud to oppose this motion.
Thank you. May I welcome the DPM?
Okay, you're up, you're live. Cool, ready? The problem with the speech we just heard is that speculation about people's mental health is the norm. If you turn on Fox News these days, that's all they're talking about, whether Swiss cheese brain Biden can actually represent the country. And on the other side, you talk about Trump and his instabilities, right? So it's already the norm that mental health is being discussed in those terms that just was saying was so bad. What can solve that? Educating the public about mental health, about the types of things that would result in such a diagnosis. And the only way you get that is by having psychiatrists with all the ethical liability and that kind of ability to make those claims and describe it properly on air.
That's the only way we're going to get those changes. But beyond that, we think, and when you have people who are putting a lot of trust in them, and the fact that their ability to be cognizant of what they're doing is so important, means that we have a direct public interest in knowing about their mental health. I'm going to talk to you about three things in my speech. Firstly, whether this information is going to be accurate, dealing with the comparative that Side Negative hasn't dealt with, because they have to talk about the way the world is discussing these kinds of issues right now. Secondly, talking about whether this information, if at all, if it's accurate, is useful, dealing with how the spectrum of disagreement between psychiatrists would actually look like. And thirdly, their point about this harmful norm and how we actually make it better on our side. Firstly, in terms of accurate diagnosis, we told you a lot about the types of standards that these psychiatrists will have and the incentives acting on them to make sure that they are, firstly, going to not be making baseless claims, are likely to be making more accurate claims than just how they characterize it on the next team, but also in terms of the where they have to make that claim, right? They will provide that basis, they will provide the evidence, and all that has to be provided in the way that they're going to show it to the populace. So what did they say on their side? They said diagnoses are always going to be inaccurate for two reasons. Firstly, that they're going to be seen from afar, you have a small window into this person's mind. Firstly, that doesn't respond to what Zach already brought you at first about the amount of information you have right now and the way you can make those kinds of claims based on actual evidence that you get from people's speeches, right? And again, the framework around how the ethical responsibility acts on the psychiatrists mean that they cannot be making those claims if the seeing from afar isn't considered to be up to the professional standards. So we think that the professional standards there do limit a lot of that abuse in terms of inaccurate statements. But even if they're not able to have a conclusive diagnosis, we still think that they're much more likely to add layers of analysis that otherwise wouldn't be got to when you have just Tucker Carlson talking about mental health in the status quo. So that additional layer of information on top of the very bad information we have right now is useful in helping people make up their minds about this. But thirdly, even if it's a limited use in terms of like a potential cause there, we tell you that first of all, that is still useful because that means that people can now start thinking about this on their own and being able to make those decisions based on the standards and facts and evidence that the psychiatrists are bringing to the table. But secondly, it also forces politicians then not to hide behind the barrier of the Goldwater rule and to allay those concerns if there were concerns before. Note, to the point at which these individuals actually have certain concerns with their mental health, we think that is them effectively lying to the public that cares about such things, and that's a harm. And forcing them or pressuring them to come up and defend themselves is in fact a good thing given the amount of responsibility we're giving those individuals. Secondly, what did they say? They said, well, this will be weaponized, right, by political partisan news media. Firstly, the punishment and the incentives acting on individual and psychiatrists in terms of a reputation, but also the fact that their quantifications we put under scrutiny means you're less likely to get those kinds of claims. Secondly, already those kinds of claims are made by pundits like Tucker Carlson that have a huge amount of credibility in the viewership that watches those shows, right? The point at which we're doing this, making this change in an already broken system gives you another credible source, and forces you to have a credible source to back those claims up. So in the environment where you can't make those claims because there's not enough evidence, psychiatrists are less likely to go up and make those claims on Fox News, which means that now the Goldwater rule not being there, there's probably going to harm the credibility of such statements because they couldn't find good psychiatrists to talk about that. On the other side, to defend against those claims, you have psychiatrists. And again, their case would be perfect if you had a complete world, perfect world right now, but it's not true. Right now, we have imperfect information. Right now, we have partisan information. This actually increases the likelihood that we can sift through that partisan information to actually get a much better conclusion on this. So what else did they say? They said, first, the next point about the usefulness of this information, they said it's not going to be useful in the way that it's presented to the audience, right? So firstly, what I've proven in that first clash over there is that you're likely to get accurate information to the point which you don't have accurate information. That is already the status quo. You're going to have more credible information to make those decisions on, which is always going to mean that you're getting an overall better picture, and you're more likely going to see the whole picture and not just the picture that Tucker Carlson shows you. Firstly, Now about the usefulness. They said, oh, because you only see in snippets of the media and how it's going to be reported, it's bad. Again, not comparative as to the way that people discuss mental health of public officials right now, right? So that means, again, they're showing that the harm there is going to happen on their side in the exact manner that they want to talk about, because that's exactly how the media deals with mental health right now. It's not true that in the status quo, they don't talk about mental health right now. So that's why that comparative fails. But what does it actually look like on our side? Again, they need to come up and show the basis of their claim. That means they come up and say, we think that Biden has these problems, and my evidence through all my learning and the work I've done already, looking at these snippets of Biden, which they can then play on that media, lets me tell to a certain degree of certainty that this may be a claim. We would advise that Biden go and get help. That means that you're more likely to get the discussion in a much better way and a much more useful way for those individuals. Again, the comparative is you don't get the discussion, you aren't able to educate those people. Here you get a direct claim, a direct viewpoint into psychiatrists' minds and how that process works and how evidence is gathered and how you can make those claims, in which means that people overall are better able to make the decision about what's true and what's not. First and secondly, they just made the claim that this shouldn't be important because you make all these other things exist that you make decisions based on who represents you or your public figures. Note that other public figures wouldn't be part of this unless they had some sort of responsibility, and mental health became a part of that responsibility. So people like CEOs, for example, do take a lot of responsibility on their hands in terms of their shareholders, and shareholders do have a vested interest to ensure that their money is handled with someone who they trust is able to handle that, and that lying about their own mental health means it's harmful there. That's why there's a general interest over there. People consent because they're taking on that responsibility. Finally, then, in terms of this harmful norm, again, like throughout my speech, there's been one clear line of analysis here. The comparative is that it's already happening, and the comparative is that conversation is already muddled and already bad. So the norms that already exist are that it's okay to speculate, but not even speculate to a degree of professional certainty, but just speculate in general about people's mental health and making claims about those things. It is true that in those instances where you're taking on responsibility, your mental health does matter immensely. How does it change on our side? First of all, we don't think necessarily it boils down to all forms of jobs that don't require the level of mental acuity. These are particular jobs that do require that and do put your responsibility is based directly on your ability to perform the duty that you're taking on. But only when you have psychiatrists that are able to convey that message with the professional standards, do you get individuals being able to understand why certain claims are made and on what basis claims are made, which stops the unfounded basis that Neg wants to talk about that might spread across the world. On our side, people deserve to know whether they're going to be held and they're going to be protected by people who can represent them. We give that to people side with side. Affirmative.
Thank you for that speech. May I welcome the DLO?
Can I be heard?
Yes.
Splendid. Affirmative almost entirely relies on us like accepting the comparative, the speculation about mental health happens at the moment. It does, but it happens in very different ways to what happens under their world for four reasons. 3 reasons, actually. One, when people discuss mental health now, you understand it to be speculation as opposed to something that is backed up by a medical body. That is to say, when Carlson talks about medical, whether he thinks Joe Biden has a Swiss cheese brain or something, you understand that, yes, that could be true, but ultimately it is one man's opinion and not an opinion held by a medical body. Secondly, there is no ostensible consensus that you can point to. Just to say that you are still in the blind along with Tucker Carlson. You are both idiots who don't know what's going on. Juxtapose that to their world where a quote-unquote expert is telling them that this person is ill or this person is diseased in a very particular way. Because I've studied the subject, am an expert in it, and therefore you ought to believe it. That authority does not exist under the status quo. The third thing is that there is very limited airtime for mental illness at the moment. Just to say that, why would you spend, as Fox News, an hour of your time talking about an unsubstantiated rumor about Joe Biden's mental health, when there's a bunch of clips that you can play of him saying that if you don't vote for him, you're not black? Like, surely that is far better for you to pick over that. We would tell you that, like, their case does not make sense. This is not the comparative we have to take. The difference in their world was threefold. One, it was obfuscated in academia and it was legitimized, which is to say that it came with an air of authority and you took it more seriously. Two, You took it as an objective fact rather than something that was one man's opinion. And thirdly, there was far, far, far more of it, which is to say that you granted it airtime, you granted it legitimacy, and you made it profitable to report on that. And that's why the comparative that they set up is bullshit. The comparative that actually exists is speculation, but speculation that is recognized as speculation. And with those 2 minutes of material, literally their entire comparative case falls out. Now what I'm going to do is go through the substantive material and explain why it's all shit. The case is very intuitive. It is, okay, information will give you some, we'll get information about the mental stability of a candidate, and then you can vote in better ways. This relies on 2 assumptions. Firstly, that the information will be good, and secondly, the voters will interpret that information well. They give you a myriad of responses to very, very scant responses. I'm going to go through it again. We tell you that the accuracy of diagnosis is unlikely to be very good. They tell us it will be because, 1, you can have certainty, and that's able to be done from the TV screen, and secondly, you don't need interpersonal connection. This team, and forgive me for saying this, relies on the stupidest possible conception of mental illness that is possible. That is to say that the way that they conceive of mental illness is, okay, he has X symptom and Y symptom, therefore he must be Z. That is not how mental illness works. Oftentimes, things like ADD, schizophrenia, bipolar, all have symptoms that are very similar to one another, which means that, firstly, their mechanism of accountability does not exist, which is to say that you can make a baseless claim and justify it, and that justification is no less legitimate than another justification. That means that their accountability mechanism falls out. Secondly, obviously there is a very large room for error that still happens, right? Like, people misdiagnose people all the time. I was misdiagnosed the first time I went to a psych. It happens to the extent to which that happened in person and you're doing it on a television screen. It's probably a higher likelihood of that happening, which means that the certainty of diagnosis was non-existent. The second claim that they tell us that's equally stupid is that, you don't need any interpersonal connection. No, there is a reason why schizophrenia is misdiagnosed so frequently. It is because people who are schizophrenic lie about the questions that they are asked, and those answers lead the psychiatrist astray. You don't look at someone and be like, yeah, this guy's got bipolar. You ask them questions, you talk them through things, you ask them about their life experience, and that's how you figure it out. Jesus fucking Christ. Which means that the conclusions that this affirmative team got to were extremely inaccurate in the vast majority of the time. And that means all of the harms that Jess told you about were legitimized to the highest degree. But secondly, and I'm going to go a step further, even if that information is good, I tell you that it'll be communicated poorly. Which is to say that Jess tells you that we live in a milieu where mental health is stigmatized to the bone. To the extent to which media organizations have profit and political incentives, that is to say that they are backed by particular political donors, they have an incentive to take information that is good, which is not going to be good, mind you, and then distort that such that it is sensationalized and makes them the most money and perpetuates their agenda the most. That looks like, for example, a psychiatrist saying, look, Tom perhaps shows symptoms of BPD, and then the media organization coming forward and saying, Tom is BPD, here's 10 reasons why he's completely loopy, or here's why he's lost his mind. The incentive to sensationalize exists, meaning that even if that information is good in the first place, the way that it plays out in voters' minds is necessarily corrupted and means that they make poorer voting decisions than they would have done in the alternative. The implication was bad information, but secondly, all the things that Jess told you about. It spread rumors about mental health that hurt people on the ground that suffered from that mental illness. Because you stereotype people of a particular illness with a particular type. You said that all people with bipolar were erratic because you pointed at Trump had slightly weird mannerisms one day on stage and you said he could be bipolar as a result of that. You painted all people with ADD as manic and crazy, and that stigmatized people on the ground. But secondly, you grew to fear those people on the ground as well because the way that you talked about mental illness was in hushed tones, with fear, with an element of disgust. And that was a fucking ginormous harm that accrued in this debate, irrespective of whether, do the way up. If voters have, one additional piece of information on top of policy, race, all that stuff to factor in, and, mentally ill people are stigmatized much, much, much more through all media organizations, I think that harm wins out even in their best case when the debate is over at that point in time. The only thing left for this team at this point in time is, okay, discussion from fake news can be challenged because fake news can fake news organizations, and this is what they said at first, can make diagnoses about people, and that will go unchallenged because psychiatrists have to bite their tongue or else they'll be in violation of the Goldwater rule. Understand that there is a difference between saying that X person is mentally ill for this reason and also saying that diagnosis doesn't make sense because for that illness to hold true, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 criteria must be fulfilled, along with a bunch of other things, and those criteria are not fulfilled, which means that it is unlikely this is very true. You are able to criticize it still, but you're able to criticize it. That's not it. That benefit is symmetric. But if anything, I would tell you it is better for us because those diagnoses are seen skeptically to begin with. because there is not an air of authority, legitimization that is granted to them that only happens in their world when you have someone who is a trained expert telling you that what they say is gospel. At this point in the debate, all of the things that we told you at Jeff resonate fucking loudly. Their claims about information don't exist, and even where they do exist, please do the weigh up and then determine my speaker scores accordingly. The final bit of substantive material that I want to give you is material that shows that this makes voting worse. Because I've given you the intuition that no information is better than having bad information. I'm going to give you that bad information also comes about as a result now. That leads them to worse voting. Just to say that understand that the way that the media shows particular people is different among people, right? That is to say that the way that a media portrays a white man compared to a white woman are significantly different. So when a white woman is particularly emotive, or when a woman generally is a bit loud or says something that is controversial, there is an incentive to dig into intuitions in a sexist society that might lead you to believe that she's hysteric or she's ridiculous, and then to play that intuition and to make you think that she is mentally ill. This is 2016's election all over again, except instead of Hillary Clinton being labeled as a killer, she's labeled as a BPD witch or something along that line. And the best part is, in their world, you can get away with that kind of claims because a trained expert is telling you that, because Hillary shows 2 symptoms that might be indicative of BPD. This was a terrible policy. I do not know why this affirmative team did veto. Very, very proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech. Now, welcome to Government Whip.
I'm going to offer some unsolicited advice, much in the spirit of the motion, to the negating team. When you just make your entire case, heaping outrage on the other team without really considering that they might in fact have quite a good case, all that sets you up for is a nasty shock when you are not in the final, and we are. The second thing that I'll tell them to do is that it's quite important not to heap lots of extra impacts when you haven't produced like actual analysis on the foundational issues, why the current conversation around mental health, where either retired psychologists or Tucker Carlson-esque people or people who wear white lab coats despite having no qualifications spout their like vicious lies on Fox News, when people create fake doctors and pump those fake news networks through people's Facebook accounts, why the alternative, even imperfectly, of psychologists having a role in this conversation doesn't have a curative aspect to the vicious lack of accountability in the alternative. It follows very briefly that I'll do 3 things. Firstly, I'll talk about correctness. Secondly, I'll talk about how this links into why diagnosis is a public service. And then finally, I'll talk about narratives on the mentally ill. And here's the big kicker. It is a lot more difficult for an individual to spout off on lots of opinions when we allow people who are actually qualified to speak on that, rather than saying that the only people should have opinions on those are unqualified people who are the only people who are allowed to have those opinions under their side of the house. On correctness, I want to note here that we talked about professional opinions. That's quite important because the opposition only responded to half of this. They responded to diagnosis. So firstly note, we have a big advantage when it comes to the cautionary material that people are also unable to deliver. Because I'll note that a lot of wild claims are put out there about like bad health. And in the second neg's outrage and explaining to us the bad claims that were thrown around at DDT, what they also miss is that doctors were able to come out and correct that claim when claims are made about people like Hillary Clinton. information, and they are unable to in the psychological standpoint, because they're unable to offer a professional opinion, that you are unable to make a diagnosis on the way, in the medical context, the way Hillary Clinton coughs and diagnosing her with like lung cancer. In the same way, people are allowed to make off the hip claims without any broad rebuttal. Note this is important because we help gatekeep out bad information, which puts our team at a big advantage in this stage of the debate. Secondly, though, let's take them at their stronger material, or where they put more effort in, or any effort in talking about diagnosis and why diagnosis is something that is bad. What I'll note, let's look at the actual mechanisms they game here, because they wanted to put impacts without justifying those mechanisms. One, they want to tell us that people will be protected politically to make bad claims. Note that's symmetrical. If they're protected politically, they're not held to the Goldwater rule currently, so they're able to make those claims. We use the same ethics board structure, so if political accountability stops you from having those ethics boards, it works symmetrically on both sides of the house. Then they want to say, external noise is a broad problem. You have campaign noise, people hide their information. There's a lot of like mischaracterization on things, which means people are unable to make good claims. What I will note here is this doesn't lead to false diagnoses. This just leads to no diagnoses, unless under their side of the house, they want to claim that way campaigns make it more likely their candidate will be diagnosed with a mental health issue. I think that's broadly unlikely, but the current ethics standards that apply means that you have to use the information that you currently have. At worst, some diagnoses won't be made through, but that's not a harm because that's symmetrical on either side of the debate. The final thing to say is that people actually have a heap of information on which to make those baseline claims. So for example, they want to put a lot of their effort into explaining why it's difficult to do the small differences in diagnoses between depression and bipolar. We agree. That's why under ethics standards, if you have a small amount of information to go off of, you won't be making a claim like this person has bipolar or this person has depression. You think that this person is exhibiting depressive symptoms that could link to an underlying mental illness, and we'd recommend them to go and get further tests in order to diagnose it. Note that they failed to take into account the fact that other professional obligations exist. We're not removing all of them, and to the degree that you can't tell someone that they have Alzheimer's in a normal room because they blink weirdly, you also aren't going to be able to do it when we get rid of the Barry Goldwater rule. Second point, why is this diagnosis a public service? Noting already, I've proved that this will have a much higher level of correctness because of these professional standards than all the other types of discussion. At Zach, we gave you two really good things. Firstly, you cut through the fake news. You actually offer professional obligation. Secondly, when a candidate is lying and they're like running for president and they could have access to the nuclear codes, it's probably bad if they have something that could lead to significant cognitive decline. And then that also, remember, they could be blackmailed for. This is a huge problem in the United States. If people have health things that they're not disclosing, they did a West Wing episode about it. I think it's really cool analysis. I think you should credit it. But also things like further verification. No response. If people are coming out and saying, hey, I'm really worried about Biden's mental health, Biden now has significant incentives to go and get his mental health checked out and then validate that to the American people. He wants to walk a fine line at the moment, maybe because he wants to hide the fact that he has mental health issues. We think the public deserves to know. How do they respond? Firstly, a semantic attack. This is public figures, not politicians. So I think we've already won where it's okay to scrutinize these people. We've proven that cognitive decline is something that people should care about. Like, we make decisions based on whether people at a baseline are smart or unintelligent, which is also something that discrimination happens and sometimes maybe shouldn't, but is a fair basis on which to make those decisions. But where we shouldn't scrutinize someone, say like a retired sports star that is still a public figure, A, there's limited interest, limited coverage. B, you have very limited info because they're not giving interviews all the time. So your ethics rules mean you can't make these bold statements. And also we just have normal solutions, right? The same things that means that doctors, though they aren't barred to give like professional opinions about lots of people, the current reputational loss, if you just start like diagnosing people in general without information, the ethics boards are enough to stop it and enough not to justify this freedom of speech. Okay. Important material still unresponded to by the opposition. What is the current environment in which mental health conversations take place? Two reasons. Firstly, you have people who go onto Tucker Carlson, wear white coats, speak in very smart ways, but aren't licensed psychologists. They just present the idea that they are giving good information. This is a very common tactic that is used. And people like Tucker Carlson, who are very trusted, are able to spout off just with their, I'm a reasonable guy. I know what dementia looks like when I see it. And people do believe them. But secondly, you actually just have literal fake news where people make up psychologists and then flood other people's Facebooks with that information. They have no curative ability to deal with that. They want to say that we get sensationalization on their side of the house, but that equally applies to all of the other stuff they are doing. How do we improve that discourse? Firstly, now you have some professional obligations. And note, now if instead of having a licensed psychologist, Tucker Carlson is spouting off, people be like, like the other like large US network has actual licensed psychologists. Why isn't Fox doing it? You push Fox to adopt the same principles, and now the entire like reputable media is bound to ethics obligations. Secondly, you have the response from other peoples. These like still unresponded to analysis about reputation is hugely important. You're going to be responded to by other public figures. That necessarily means that you are careful about the statements you make, afraid of being pushed back on. Look, this is incredibly important. We think we've won the debate on this basis because the value isn't just in the idea of this person having the accurate cognitive function that's important, but this candidate has been lying to you. And even if I disagree with the fact that like it's like someone with a mental health disability shouldn't be able to become president, the fact that you are lying to the public who have a democratic right to make that decision is a huge black mark against the opposition. Final point in this debate, effect on the mentally ill. Note, they just wanted to say that we get a huge norm change. I'm going to flip this analysis and explain how the norm actually becomes worse under their side of the house than our side of the house. Because firstly, we now, when people are barred from speaking, there's a huge idea that people who are mentally unwell are muzzling other people who otherwise would be able to speak and contribute to public discourse because they have huge amounts of shame, they're liar, they're inherently untrustworthy. That furthers the narratives that the opposition wants to talk about a lot more. But secondly, when you bar people who are actually qualified for making decisions, that means the norm of the people you go to verify whether information is true is people like Tucker Carlson or people who don't have professional obligations, whereas under our side of the house, you are much less likely as an individual to make a claim because some like random psychologist might come in and fucking wreck you. That's the reason why a lot of people make huge statements about mental health, but don't make a lot of statements unless they're really invested in fake news, to making statements about people's personal health, because we understand that expertise of doctors is the only thing we should be listening to on the public stage, and they systematically bar it. At the end of this is at best for them a wash, but at worst for them is actually a flip to our side of the house, because they increase the difficulty of having the correct voices rise to the top. End of the debate. Very happy to stand for just being honest and open with the public.
All right. Thank you for that speech. Can I welcome to Op-Whip?
Can I be heard?
Yes. All good.
Thank you. When they're presented with information they can't fully understand and are expected to make a judgment, human beings use a variety of heuristics to distinguish between what kind of information they should believe. And one of the most common powerful heuristics is that of expertise. We attach certain forms of status to certain people and then assume that based on their status, they would have certain types of information that helps them know things that other people with different statuses won't. So the way that most people interact with most kind of information they either can't be bothered or don't know how to understand, which is often very true for the complexity and nuances of different types of discussions around different mental conditions, the way they kind of adjudicate between what's true and what's not is they defer to expertise. They listen to status. And the problem, and notably, they listen to that more than what is actually said by, whoever's talking. They listen to what is the person's rank, right? In terms of, are they a licensed psychologist or are they a person in a white coat on a Tucker Carlson show? And the problem for the opposition, or the problem the opposition identify is they say, well, status is currently being debased, which is to say that people right now are getting out there talking about the, mental health, and they're pretending to be psychologists, and therefore the status of psychologists is debased. And if only we could bring in higher status people who could then resolve the arguments that exist there and resolve those particular arguments and sort of beat out the bad information. The problem for the affirmative team is that allowing psychiatrists to enter the debate debases the status of psychiatry as a whole. And this is a complex but very important point. The way it works now is that Tucker Carlson says something about someone's mental health, but the expectation and the way that is reported by other people in the media and the way that is refuted, as they wanted to talk about, is, well, Tucker Carlson said this, but psychiatrists say it's impossible to correctly diagnose someone's mental health without being an expert and having talked to them. which is to say the value of the Goldwater rule isn't really in preventing individual psychiatrists from stepping out and criticizing people, right? Like, admittedly, like obviously it is within the ethics board, so they can be sued if they don't correctly obey the certain rules that, you know, because the Goldwater rule is a specific professional legal obligation that they have. But importantly, the actual benefit is that the media and people generally can go, well, it's impossible to actually comment on someone's mental health because even psychiatrists can't comment on someone's mental health without knowing that. At the point that you debase status in that way, you unleash the capacity of everyone to say everything, anything about anyone's mental health. And notably, in a political context, given that having a mental health issue is a stigmatizing thing, there are already very strong professional, like political incentives to try and smear the other side or another candidate as mentally ill. And the only thing restraining that, the only thing keeping that in line is the Goldwater rule, which says, well, you can't comment without knowing the person and without being a mental health professional, which is why we get, like, obviously there is much speculation on mental health, but remarkably, very few of it actually lands. Dan wanted to talk about mechanisms, and I honestly think he was a little bit patronizing, given his own mechanism isn't particularly well swept through. Here is the critical mechanism that must occur for affirmative team to win this debate. They say there is bad information right now, and that information can be improved because we will allow psychiatrists to fix and correct the record. That necessarily relies upon the public being able to distinguish between Tucker Carlson's analysis of someone's mental state and a psychiatrist's analysis of its mental state. Something that most people are not necessarily capable to do except through status, and you debase that status by bringing psychiatrists into the game. Like, the Republicans are going to have a coterie of people who make barely legal claims, and I'll get to ethics boards in a minute, they make barely legal claims about other, of the Democratic Party's, the mental status of Democratic Party candidates, and they'll be able to get away with it now and they wouldn't be previously. Here's the thing. You'll notice in the last speech, Dan was like, well, psychiatrists will have to be careful. They'll have to say exhibiting depressive symptoms instead of has depression. But for the overwhelming majority of the population, exhibiting depressive symptoms is a formal diagnosis and distinguishes you as someone who has a mental disorder. Now, obviously, technically that is not true, and medically that it may not be true, but in the minds of most people, which is exactly the kind of problem that occurs here, they expect the ordinary public to be able to engage with a level of nuance that they simply can't. The reason we have status is because ordinary people struggle to differentiate between being diagnosed with depression and exhibiting depressive symptoms. That is why we have status. And if you allow that status to be debased, if you allow it to become very partisan, which is exactly what will occur, you remove the capacity of anyone to talk with authority about mental health of a public figure ever again. The first thing I'm going to do is prove that the next thing I'm going to do in this speech is prove that this information is unlikely to be accurate, despite what Affirmative would have you believe. The second thing I'll prove, even if somehow it is accurate, is unlikely to be processed ever in a democratically relevant fashion, which means it cannot be said to actually improve the outcome of elections, which is what they wanted. They wanted better elections over time. And then the final thing I'll talk about is how this doesn't improve political decision-making, which is their ultimate goal, right? To improve elections, then improve political decision-making. And then once I've done that, I'll talk a little bit about individuals and the way this shapes norms around them. On to whether people can actually correctly kind of create diagnoses from a distance. The simple answer is they can't, because many mental illnesses are comorbid, which is to say they share symptoms. All of that means is that often someone who has depression and schizophrenia may exhibit similar symptoms, and a psychiatrist may be able to say to an ethics board, they were exhibiting symptoms of X. All I did was write exhibiting symptoms of depression or exhibiting depressive symptoms, and that is enough for them to not be punished in an ethics sense, but it is enough to label and smear that person in a political campaign, which is exactly where AF's analysis falls down, because they give people the legal room to smear and they rob the media and the psychiatric profession of the ability to say, no, we don't allow anyone to comment ever, because no one should be able to use the legitimacy of the profession to comment politically in that way. They rob the ability of that genuine rebuttal. It's the scientific consensus here that works, because remember, when Tucker Carlson says Hillary Clinton is insane, what other people in the media are able to say is, well, the consensus of the psychiatric profession is you can't comment on someone's mental health unless you've interacted with them and you are a mental health professional. And the moment you take away that consensus, you open the floodgates for people on both sides to start sniping each other and accusing each other of exhibiting symptoms of BPD or depression. The big thing we hear though, and this is the critical thing, is they say, well, they kind of hand wave away the fact that perception is filtered through partisan analysis. They hand wave away the fact that most misdiagnosis happens to an extraordinarily high extent because it's easier to diagnose a broken leg than it is to diagnose a broken brain. And the only thing they fall back on is, well, ethics boards will prevent psychiatrists from engaging in bad things. But as I've already explained, all a psychiatrist needs to do is explain that someone is exhibiting depressive symptoms, and that is enough for them to be fined in an ethics sense. The Republican Party is probably going to pay their legal costs anyway, and at that point, you've destroyed someone's reputation, and there's no ability for someone to say, well, the consensus of the medical opinion is that you shouldn't comment at all, and we'll strip your license away. So you guys reduce there's already a lot of incentive to comment politically on someone's mental state. You guys just remove the guardrails. Even if that weren't true, and even if the diagnoses were likely to be accurate, the problem is that the stigmatization of mental health dominates people's understanding of a candidate, even without partisanship or even without anything like that. Which is to say, you don't pay attention to someone's policies if you think they are mentally ill because you don't believe that, which is just, and you instead dominate that. So actually more judgments come about whose psychiatrist is more persuasive than instead of what policies are better. So you get democratically worse outcomes, and politicians are less likely to seek medical help, which results in worse political decision-making over time. The final thing is, when this happens, the final thing to note here is that when politicians are scrabbling around to prove they are mentally ill, that sends a terrible signal that being mentally ill is something you should be afraid of, should be proud of, and disqualifies you from political office or high decision-making power, which is exactly why it worsens norms around mental illness. For all of those reasons, we are incredibly proud to oppose.
Thank you. May I welcome our reply?
The first thing I want to look at in this reply speech is accuracy, because we provided a number of reasons as to why this is likely to be inaccurate, whether we're calling this a diagnosis or an opinion or whatever, right? And those were because it was likely to be very difficult to do so from a distance, because external factors often influence your view of someone, such as how the media portrays them, such as the fact that it was very open to weaponization by different political parties. And even if the core opinion was accurate, it was likely to be distorted in the way in which it was discussed in the media. They had a few responses to this throughout the case. The first was that the incentive structure for psychiatrists is that you're unlikely to say information that is inaccurate because of potential punishments. But we explained that you are likely to be shielded by different individuals, and the very mechanism they point to, which is that you can just say things that sound like very soft opinions, means you're easily able to get away with that inaccuracy, because again, it's just an opinion. You're able to shroud it in quite vague language, as they explained at third. So that's why the punishment mechanism they suggest does not apply. They then say that there's likely to be different discussion about this, and eventually we'll form some sort of consensus about what is the accurate opinion here. But that was never really explained. And if anything, that just made the debate more confusing, because again, there was no real consensus about someone's mental illness. You just had a lot of different competing opinions that didn't really get anywhere. But I suppose finally, their most, impactful material was the idea that there's already more inaccurate information that exists in the public sphere, and this is a countervailing sort of thing to that. But we had a number of responses to that, which easily defeated that material. The first was, obviously having bad information is not a reason to have maybe slightly better information, but still bad information. Secondly, though, you just establish and encourage a norm that it is okay to speculate about mental illness, so then your ordinary Joes are just going to do this more. But thirdly, as we explained, you give it a stamp of legitimacy and authority by saying it is from a psychiatrist. And fourthly, the Goldwater rule itself is the very thing that rebuts that analysis, because the Goldwater rule says you ought not speculate. We do not have enough information to form an accurate opinion. So that material doesn't stand. And note that this is basically the thing which overcomes their really singular benefit, which is a more informed voting populace. Because if the information is on balance, likely to be inaccurate, it serves very little utility. Even if it has some utility, our point was you can form those opinions in other ways. Maybe they are not quite as probative, but our point was that they are sufficient. You can ask questions like, is this person intelligent enough to hold office? Is this person too aggressive to hold office? And so on and so on. It's not the same, but it is enough. And that overcomes, again, like essentially the one reason they give you to weight their case. Compare that to literally a host of harms that we give you, which apply especially if it's likely to be inaccurate, but even if it is likely to be somewhat accurate, right? The fact is, it disincentivizes politicians from getting help because it encourages you to act more cautiously. It encourages misunderstandings and stereotypes around mental illness. It encourages a norm that it's okay to speculate and intrude upon people's privacy, not just politicians, but everyday individuals, people just trying to get a job. It creates a norm that it's okay to disqualify someone from a position because of mental illness, when the majority of people have a good majority of people have some form of mental illness and can be perfectly functioning members of society. We also tell you that it's likely to impact women above all. And again, they just fall back here on their same, thing around, but there's already inaccurate info. Obviously, again, this makes it worse. Compare all of those harms to literally maybe a bit more information in political discourse. I think it's clear that we've won.
Thank you. Gov, reply when you're ready.
In all my years of debating, I've never had a third negative speaker win a debate for the affirming team for us. Because in Brendan's speech halfway through, he says we need to prove that people are more likely to believe psychiatrists over any other kind of person. But then in his introduction, he says people are not educated and lazy and defer to symbols of authority. When psychiatrists aren't commentating, that's all the fake doctors that Daniel told you about and people on Fox News that speak with authority about mental health issues, which meant that because of that, at the moment you had actual experts, people with degrees in psychiatry talking about them, they became the authoritative voice now. What that meant, importantly, is that people are already buying into this material. They already at the moment think that this is legitimate discussion on mental health. We change that because we get actual experts in to discuss these issues. First, on the status quo of discussions of mental health. They basically tell you that spurious claims aren't treated seriously or whatever, effectively just that like, at the moment, you don't listen to these experts, whatever. We told you, importantly, that lazy people consume this media in a way that is particularly uncritical and they believe people that are like fake doctors. What changes now, importantly, as I'll cover in the next point, is that they're actual experts. But importantly, coupling with that, there is already an existing norm about mental health being discussed. It's just that psychiatrists do not participate in that. They believe the Goldwater rule entirely shuts down those discussions, but it only suppresses psychiatrists from entering those discussions in the first place. And that must be the comparative this debate is assessed against in the next issue. Second then, will this information be accurate? And this was all the information that Deepak in his second speech called shit. But the only thing that was shit was his listening skills. Because when they told you that like political protection and costs are such a big issue in this debate, that's symmetric. Because if that's true, then under the Goldwater rule at the moment, people can breach it that are psychiatrists and they still get their legal costs paid. If anything though, it's better under our side of the house because now psychiatrists are a countervailing voice to those bad actors that are always politically protected. But importantly, we told you as well that diagnosis in this case is not the only path, but instead professional advice on what could be a litany of issues that could fall within the umbrella of a personality disorder. It wasn't as crude as saying shared symptoms and all that or individual things. It was pointing out that someone may have issues that could be indicated in this way, and they could then follow up to verify that. It wasn't never the crude tool of diagnosis. Then they say that this information will not be accurate because of the media environment. Importantly, this will still be a comparatively better information compared to the status quo where lazy people consume this as gospel. Deepak then, in what was his shittest line of analysis, says schizophrenic people lie all the time. But that was our case, right? That even inside a room, it's hard to get truthful statements from people about their mental acuity because they're still being performative. They gave us no reason and no response to my first speech about why watching hundreds of hours of recordings and the way people act and interact does not provide the same basis for that information. So this was likely to be accurate information in the end, which then brings you to the last issue. Was this valid? We told you this information was critically important, that these were decision makers that had a large amount of control over people's lives, and there was no response to that. All they said was that it's not that important, and you create a norm that harms people by encouraging people to shield their mental health. They do that at the moment because they're currently scrutinized for their mental health by the poor quality of discourse that happens around that. When it's psychiatrists, that norm is eroded. Daniel told you this to no response, and Jess just seemed to conveniently ignore it. We also told you as well that it furthers narratives of people being deceitful. What they then say is that like the media like do more work in this now, and they like instead of focusing on things like Joe Biden saying stuff about black, they report on both. Obviously, in terms of debasing the quality of debate, this is always about lifting information. They just never understood that in this debate, people take armchair analysis that I provide about Joe Biden being demented and cheese-brained as credible and gospel when I put a lab coat on that gets better when you put actual professionals in charge of that discussion.